שנשתמש יותר במחשבים מהסוג הזה, נגיד לי אחר כך איך אני מסדר שיראו רק את מי שנמצא ורק את מי שמראה את התמונה ולא את כולם. לא, מישהו יודע איך עושים את הפרופרטיז, אני צריך להיכנס פשוט. אוקיי. קצת במקום אחר במחשבים שונים. אז שלום לכולם, אנחנו היום באירוע היברידי, הציבור כאן בכיתה והאורחים שלנו על המסך, כרגע מאחוריי, אתם יכולים לראות את זה מי שנמצא. So I'll move to English since our meeting will be in English, although not sure if although discussing things connected to us here in Israel under the title of Ideology, Technocracy and Zionism, and this is the title for 4 meetings which are divided, which were held in Ben-Gurion University, Bar-Ilan University, and this is the 3rd one, and the 4th will be in Van Leer. So the terms are connected, but each can be attend separately. So I hope you will enjoy this meeting. We have 3 speakers tonight. Anat Leibler, which is here with us, and across the ocean, Golan and Derek Penslar. I will give the floor shortly to Tal. I will just introduce Tal very shortly. Tal holds a PhD from the University of California at Berkeley in History of Science, and he teaches south of that from the University of California, San Diego, at the History Department and the Science Studies program. And his current research focuses mainly on the role of science in the modern state. He is currently engaged in 2 research projects. One is Zionism and science, and the second is the history of statistical evidence. And he's been working on a book on the first project, provisionally titled The Natural History of Zionism, and he hopes it sees the daylight in the next year. That's true. We're quite close to it. I will also introduce the other 2 speakers, so we'll make it faster for the continuation. Anat Leibler is a senior faculty at the graduate program of Science and Technology Studies at Bar-Ilan University. She received her PhD from the university where Tal is now, at San Diego, in the Science Studies and Sociology program. This is dissertation entitled Nationalizing Statistics, a comparative study of the development of official statistics during the 20th century in Israel, Palestine, and Canada. I think people here know more about the Israeli part, of course, it's closer to our, and also later research on that. And her research interest has 3 main venues: social history of national statistics, connected with the nation-state building, biographies of ethnic classifications, and activism by number. Our third speaker is Derek Penslar from Harvard University. He has been working on history of Zionism in connection with technology and science for many years, and among his published books, there are quite many. I will mention is Zionism and Technocracy: The Engineering of Jewish Settlement in Palestine, 1870-1918, which appeared in 1991. In Cells of Jewish Community, Jewish Identity in Germany and Austria, 1918-1933. Israel Historical Revisionism from Left to Right, Orientalism and the Jews, Israel in History, the Jewish State in Comparative Perspective, and more recently, Jews and the Military History, And just last year is Theodor Herzl, the charismatic leader. So that's, I think, will be enough for the introduction. I'll give you, Tal, the floor.
Okay, can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, you do it.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to participate in the seminar in the Cohen Institute. I would like to thank Derek and Anat, or Professor Penslar, and Dr. Leibler to join me on this panel. I'm going to say a few things about the structure of the series, and then I'm going to move to my talk. On September 20th, I believe, on 21st, maybe, the first group of people settled in the Jezreel Valley, the first Zionist group. So we are about 100 years after that. It is true that there were settlements before, or Jews immigrated to Palestine, and even some Zionist origin stories exist, of course, before World War I, but the big move, the systematic, following the decision of the Congress, the Zionist World Congress. So that was the big first move of the Zionist organization to start on a colonization systematic program, and it started in Jezreel Valley 100 years ago, pretty much. Well, we are late by 3 months, or no, 2 months. So that was I guess, the impetus behind the series. Now, the main planner, the key person behind this operation was Dr. Arthur Rupin. And he was the key person, not just behind the colonization itself, but also intimately and sometimes dominantly involved in creating the new form of the settlement, including the social forms, the commune, including the agricultural forms, which are the mixed farming models. So you can say that the Jezreel Valley was kind of a laboratory for all those colonization forms that later expand elsewhere. All right, so this is just as a background. And another important thing is that biography, Rupin's biography, there existed one that was written in the middle of the 20th century by a historian who worked in a labor research institute, and it's not really up to date. It's a good one, but very much colored by the labor ideology. But 10 years ago, Dr. Eitan Blum published a biography of Rupin, and it was translated last year, 10 years later, also to Hebrew. So this is another good occasion, and those are the two factors, I guess, behind the series. We already had 2 meetings. The first one dealt with the new biography, Eitan Blum's biography, and it was accepted with mixed response. And so we had kind of a debate about, yes, biographies and Rupin and Zionism, and what is exactly that bothers historiographers of Zionism with the book. The second panel dealt mainly with immigration policies and how race theories played into them. And now we are doing the third one. And next week, we're going to have a roundtable where we can talk about the series, what came up from the series, what can we learn from it, and what actually can we learn from the cross-section of history of science and technology, and history of Zionism and history of colonialism, etc. Okay, this was my, I guess, my introduction to the series, and I apologize, it took a little too much time. Let me move to my own lecture, and I will share with you my screen. All right, I hope you can see my screen now. All right, so in my lecture, I'm going to limit myself to the early Zionism. I'm going to talk about, I will have two parts in my talk. The first one, I will talk about Herzl and his vision of the place of technocracy, technology, and I will differentiate between the two later. So I will first talk about Herzl, and then I will talk about what happened in the post-Herzlian era, more precisely post-World War I. Because there was a transition period between the death of Herzl, where there were power struggles, what the real new hegemony that started with Weizmann and later continued with Ben-Gurion and others, really shaped after World War I. So these are the two periods, and I'm going to argue that in the first period, technocracy ruled, or at least was a primary factor, and that changed. It was demoted in the post-Herzlian era. And what replaced the engineers and the policymakers were pioneers, infused and ready to die for the cause. And also changed the narrative, of course. All right, so I'm going to start in the first part. First, I'm going to talk about the role of technocracy in external nature. That is, how do you deal with Palestine, which was, according at least to the Zionist stories and Western, was abused for centuries by bad practices. And I'm going to look there to see how Herzl was trying to deal with the problem, and it's a classic colonial problem, right? How do you take root in the foreign territories and one that is not in good shape? So I'm going to look at the Jewish state. That's his first publication. And then I'm going to talk about the second problem that the Zionists had, which is how to improve on internal nature. That is, the Jewish race, which was also abused by centuries of, mistreatment and political prosecution. And to see how Herzl dealt with it, we can take a look at Altneuland, where we approached. And then I will talk about, third, I'm going to talk about the post-Herzlian era. I'm going to talk about the rise of the new narrative of the Chalutzim. And I'm going to specifically zero again on specific chapter that will demonstrate those tensions in action. I will talk about the first senior Zionist conference after the World War. Actually, two of them in London in 1920 and 21, when for the first time after the war, the Zionist leaders came together to decide how to move forward now that this door was open. And there was an open clash there between politicians and technocrats. So this is the structure of my talk. Let me move forward as quickly as I can. This is just to start with, I think I'm using Martin Buber's description of Herzl's thing and view on technocracy. And as usual, Buber is doing it very nicely, so I thought I'll use it. He says, Herzl loved to think in technical terms. He didn't realize how mistaken it was to consider technical progress, even the greatest, a renaissance. And he went even farther. He believed in the technique. This was not simply an estimation of the technique as a mere instrument, which the human spirit, if pure and just, could do all kinds of things with it. No. Here's the technique itself brings with it, according to this view and new spirit. You can, of course, misuse it, devise bombers instead of recreational airplanes, etc. But eventually, the new spirit dominates and leads to superior culture and way of life. So this is kind of just as a teaser, if you want to talk about later. But I'm going to try. Buber actually don't get it. What Herzl is? Why is this so? So I'm going to talk about some meanings in Herzl technocracy, right? So first, let's discuss how technology, or in this case, the technocrats, helps the Zionist project. That is, move masses of people, mass immigration to a new country with meager natural resources, people without money, with little skill in agriculture, etc. How do you help them stand against nature? And the plan that Herzl put together came out in 1896, right? That's the Judenstaat, the Jewish state, right? Here is also a nice translation in the same year to Yiddish. Now, what I want you to look at is not actually the title, which everybody remember, but the second, the subtitle, where it says an attempt at a modern solution of the Jewish question. That's important because there were many attempts to solve the Jewish problem. And Herzl specifically says this is a modern solution. And what's modern about it? It's technology, or what he calls the great friends of humanity, of modern humanity, the machines. So what Herzl really suggests in this book is kind of a second Exodus, right? Once again mobilized by Jewish misery, but this time is got new deities, right? It's capital and it's science. And I'm just trying to keep up with Herzl drama about this. So let me quote a paragraph from the book to see where he goes. Not more than 40 years ago, gold digging was carried on in an extraordinarily primitive fashion. But today, what is gold digging like in Transvaal today? What is gold digging like in the Transvaal today? Transvaal is South Africa, basically, part of South Africa today. And adventurous vagabonds are not there. Sedate geologists and engineers alone are on the spot to regulate its gold industry and to employ ingenious machinery in separating the ore from surrounding rock. Little is left to chance now. Thus, we must investigate and take possession of the new Jewish country by means of every modern expedient. So, right, so this is in the Jewish state. And again, this points to this Herzl. He was blamed by many of his critics. He was compared, for example, to Shabtai Tzvi, the false prophet that brought a lot of misery. And his argument was that we are not in the 17th century, we are 20th century, and today we can do with technology much more. Okay, so what was the plan? Herzl plan, so it is technophile, even, you know, yes, well, what's the plan? The plan is taken basically very much from the colonial playbook of the late 19th century, the plans in the book. First, you secure a charter from the local ruler, and in Palestine, because Palestine, this is the Sultan. And then with the charter at hand, you go to the money market and you raise investment capital. Once you have the charter and the capital, you create a land company, development company before, and you organize a scientific survey of the territory. And based on the scientific survey, you develop, you know, a rational plan of improvement, land distribution, etc. This is very much based on what happened in Rhodesia and by that time, and we know that Herzl was very much impressed by what's happening there. So this is the first role, if you will, of technocracy in the Zionism, right? It helps the Jews to rule over nature, external nature. In the case of Palestine, it's a big task, right? It's a classical colonial test, and what we see that Herzl adopting the colonial model. Now let's move to the second part. I might talk about what about internal. So the Jews, Herzl knew, for example, that his kind, the assimilated Jews will not support this program, will ridicule it, actually. His soldier would have to come from the Ostenjuden, from those mass of Jews to the east in the Pale of Settlement. And Herzl wasn't assimilated Jews, right? At the height of, he grew up at the height of the emancipation. The Ostenjuden for him was prime example of what happened when a certain society has been oppressed for centuries. They were deformed, they were primitive, they were an embarrassment for Jews like Herzl, who adopted, the German culture. He used to refer to them, for example, as refuse. When he talks to Baron Rothschild and specifically to Hirsch, I think if I quote, he promised them to transform this refuge to beautiful society the same way that aniline dyes were produced from tar, from leftover of coal industry, from garbage. And again, Herzl is, we can come back to this later if you want, he's a Spencerian, I guess, that's the closest you can identify him in many of his circles, kind of a Darwinian, social Darwinians in the German version. So, and he thinks about the Jewish race as need rehabilitation as well. He has another, so how do you deal with them here? Herzl is adopting a second model, which is a liberal model that was developed in order to deal with the implications of the expression of the voting rights in Europe, the suffrage. And liberals were very much concerned with the irrationality of the masses and how, the rise of the fascist parties. And there was a lot of discussion about this in fin de siècle Europe, and specifically in the utopian genre. So if you look at the utopian genre, in the last decade of the 19th century, you'll find things like Freiland by Theodor Herzl, okay, the Society of the Future. This one is specifically interesting because this guy worked at the same newspaper that Herzl worked. And another one was Looking Backwards for Edward Bellamy. And then William Morris, News from Nowhere. Just one second, I need to see something here. Okay, so these were liberal utopians, right? And they were trying, as I said, to address the problem of those new mass politics, right? They are, if you will, they avoided the previous kind of utopias, the ominous ending of the Marxist, of the anarchist utopias, and instead they're trying to work out to describe an ideal society where you have socials and economic mechanisms that could break down the cycle of human misery produced by, the capitalistic cycles of the time. It was books that were supposed to provide an alternative, an enlightened alternative, as I said, to revolutionary violence by taming and channeling the powers of technology and capital and using them for the benefits of everybody. I'm expanding on this because, just one second. Sorry, guys, because this is the second model that Herzl is using. One second, I lost it. I'm reading something that I wrote about this. Okay, so Altneuland follow very much closely this recipe of those utopias, right? It portrayed a rational society without blemishes, that solved the problem of the irrational masses through the suspension of mass politics. Altneuland has no mass parties. Instead, it was ruled by a technocratic elite that undercut the political power of the common people. Yes, Altneuland possessed an elected president and Congress, but the Congress only sat a few times, a few weeks per year, and the president was purely honorary. the key decision was taken by politically neutral experts to replace the professional politician at the centers of power. Okay, so, and I can say more about this, but I'll stop here with this. So that's Herzl's second solution that came out in Alt-Leuland in 1902, right? Sorry, I got mixed up a little with my slides. Okay, I'll move quickly. What happened? So Herzl died in 1904, and soon after the war broke. There's not much serious moves in the basic structure of Zionism during that time, except for trying to survive. Things changed quickly after the war, and not just the change, but there's this feeling that a historical opportunity opened its door, and we've got to do something. And the Zionists after the war, coming together for the first time in the summer of 1920 in London, because that's where things going to happen after the war, in London, and they meet there. On the European side, the traditional side of Zionism, where it grew, came many leaders, but the heroes, of course, are Weizmann and Sokolov. No, that's Balfour, that's Lord Balfour, and that's Sokolov here, right? These are the leaders of the old. But joining the conference are the new stars of the Jewish diaspora, right? The Americans. And Europe is bankrupt. If anything's going to happen, it's going to be financed by American money. This is the leader of American Zionism, Louis Brandeis, a legendary figure in America, justice of the Supreme Court, the pride of American Jewry, or at least the elite of them. And these are two classic supporters of him. This is Rabbi Weiss, Stephen Weiss. He is the founder of the American Federation of Zionists. And this one is Nathan Strauss, coroner of Macy's. All right, so in the conference, basically what happened is everybody agreed that we got to move quickly and establish a colonization development in Palestine. And to do that, we have to create a new fund and raise a lot of money, because the people who comes in don't have private money and no skills. Anyway, I'm not going to get into this. The thing is that, of course, the European expected the American to finance this and to finance. And Brandeis said, sure, we'll do it. We'll be happy to do it. But we have to change. We have conditions, if you will. Okay? Basically, what Brandeis said is that the age of politics ended with the Balfour Declaration, with the pro-Zionist British policies. Now it's the time to develop Palestine, and development is not a business for politicians. It's for experts, for economists, for engineers. So yes, we will give the money, but we want to control how it will be spent, and we want to create a mechanisms, a technocratic mechanism. Basically, what Brandeis is suggesting, that he wants to reshape the Zionist organization in the spirit of American progressive politics at the time, ruled by technocrats. And Weizmann is saying no, not just Weizmann, the European, which were the majority of the provisional board at the time. Basically, they say no, Zionism is a political project with political goals, and it needs to be controlled by political organization. The break is shaping up the whole decade of the 20s, because Weizmann eventually wins it. Okay, but Brandeis is humiliated, is separating himself from Zionist organization, and with him, his whole circle of most of the rich donors, potential donors. So this is critical, because the Zionist organization is struggling through the 20s. They don't have money at all, bankrupt. And that forces Weizmann to get in bed with the socialists. Weizmann never liked too much the socialist. Right? but he has no choice because they offer him the only viable position. This is, I'll just show you, this is Weizmann is going, the summer after his debate with Brandeis, he's trying to recruit desperately money in America, and he recruits Einstein to come with him. But Einstein is troubling for him to fundraising for the Zionists. This is Osishkin. I got to go and finish. My point is, so this is a key event after the war when they come down to design the colonization program. And the American Brandeis are pushing for a technocratic operation, if you will, somewhat like what Herzl thought about. Okay, and Weizmann and the other insist that this is not the case. The politicians need to control. And you can, and this is not just a political decision. This is change the whole narrative. This is change the model. You don't do plantation economy, which necessitate a lot of capital. You got to move to mixed farming, and specifically, you got to use the communes because they are the cheapest, most available solution that the Zionists could move forward with. And of course, the guy that supports it behind the scene is Rupin, and he is kind of cooperation with, but I'm going to stop here, and hopefully we can come back to some of it later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tal.
And there are second speaker, Anat Leibler, sit there. Perhaps will be easier for near the.
Yes, but where is the camera?
The camera is there.
Okay. It's not in the computer because it's horrible. No, it's camera obscura. Panoptical. Okay. Okay, thank you for inviting me to give a paper. It's part of this series. Since the first session that was in Bar Ilan,
I'll try to play something with it.
where is it?
No,
No,
the camera is there. Yes.
Okay.
You have to speak.
No, speak.
Thank you. So since the first session that was in Bar Ilan, at the STS colloquium, I have been thinking about Arthur Rupin and have having absorbed Nazi views in the early 19th century. And I wanted to break down this argument and at least Eitan Bloom's argument, and to contextualize it in the history of the development of statistics and the very tight link to eugenics, and speak about the differences between eugenics in England and in Germany, in Sweden, the US, and in Israel. In each country, there is at least one manifestation and maybe more than one, as was in the case of Germany. And so we cannot speak about eugenics as something that is directly related to Nazis, ideology, so on and so forth. And I wanted to break it down. But this is a project that is not appropriate for, or does not fit a 15 minutes session, which is pity. So I decided to concentrate on extract the question of technocracy, Zionism, and perhaps eugenics, and to attempt to understand when various writings and practices are considered racist or thought of as belonging to dark times, and when are they part of the vision of prophets of modernity that existed in many countries, especially during state building eras, while creating the new nation state or federation, as was in Canada, Israel, and France. I will moved. So this is the context of the paper, and I shorten it while Tal was stopping and talking. Okay, so shall be gentle with me. Okay, so my protagonist for this paper is Bucky, who was
perhaps a bit easier to sit there, to stand there, if you,
to stand here. Yes,
perhaps a bit better for you. Just for
yes, sure. Okay, so my protagonist is Bucky. I conducted my PhD a dissertation on part of my dissertation was on him, his role in nation-state building in Israel. As statistician, he was the chair. He was the main scientist of CBS, Central Bureau of Statistics. He established CBS and was the strongest and the dominant scientist in statistics until 1971, when he retired. He also established two departments at the Hebrew University, was Dean of Social Sciences. He had a lot of titles. He got the Israel Prize, but nevertheless he stayed in the background of the history of Israel and history of the state of Israel. And it is interesting why it happened, but I don't. I think Derek is going to speak a little bit about technocrats and why they remain in the background as long as I mean, it is as what I saw in his paper. Okay, so Bucky was an eminent figure in the history of statistics in Israel. He offered new understanding of the use of statistics to the local community by bringing up the question of Jewish reproduction in Eretz Israel, Palestine, and associating it with national conflict. He was doing it prior to his to the establishment of the state during the 40s. But the question, the question that I was asking myself, was he a technocrat? According to definitions that are in the literature, and I think Bucky was neither a technical expert nor scientist who used the legitimacy or abused the legitimacy of science to act in the political field. He was a boundary actor who operated on the interface between political and scientific domains, he influenced actors from both worlds and pleased two sets of principles remaining stable in the face of external forces. This unique position of being the mediator in translating politics to science and science to politics can be found in other countries during periods of structuring the modern state. A process making extensive use of practices of constructing the territorial, social and political boundaries of the new political entity. Canada and France provide a similar example to Israel of how technocrats who dominated domains of instrumental knowledge, such as statistics, in the realm of the state, saw themselves as responsible for national progress and its social modernity. But I cannot get into details about to prove this argument, but it is very interesting how Hamilton Coates, in one example is Robert Hamilton Coates, who was the founder of the Canadian Dominion Bureau of Statistics in 1918, saw his role as the one who established a national laboratory. The Federal Bureau of Statistics, he titled it a national laboratory for the prosecution of civil research conceived from the widest angle and allied to the lines which such research should follow in indicating and assisting the evolution of the nation's progress. This is citation, a quotation of Coates. In France, argues Paul Rabineau in his French modern book. These technocrats were technicians of general ideas, professionals in statistics, economics, hygiene, epidemiology, and the like. They were inventors and practitioners of practices, discourses, and symbols of social modernity, whose aim was to understand and to regulate modern society, France, Israel, Canada, and so on. So my research is social history of national statistics in Canada and Israel, examines material, institutional, and epistemological aspects of statistical practices during the period of nation-state formation. Naturally, because of Bucky's dominant role and significance, and his social, political, and demographic perception as it manifests itself, and his writing has he had a significant place in the research, in my research. But scholars ask me very often why I don't write a biographical book about the man, or why I don't examine and explain his perception as something that stems from the time he received his training, the time between the two world wars in fascist Italy. Okay, why I don't connect his statistical legacy to fascist Italy? And my answer is that I was looking to explain and describe the biography of various metrics in the organization of the Israeli state building processes. So it's I'm doing a biography of these processes rather than biography of the person, a biography of how we constitute, how the Mizrahi category was constituted since the 40s until it became Asia, Africa, Asia, Africa, Europe, America, a formal category of the state, right, of the state bureaucracy. So I'm looking to portray these biographies of these processes, such as the biography of ethnic classification, the standardization of national income measurements, and the crystallization of Israeli citizenry body with its unique ethnocratic characteristics. In each of these objects of study, Bucky was the most dominant figure, but he was not a sole player. He was not a single architect. He needed an infrastructure of political patrons, professional allies, technology, as well as the power of the new state. Without these, he would remain a charismatic person, but not as influential as he was. And this is a reply to Eitan. Eitan, I think, is not here, to Eitan's book.
It's in the Zoom.
Okay, so it is a sort of, I mean, I am trying to discuss some things with Eitan's book. Okay, in 1944, in a memorandum addressed to Ben-Gurion, Sherto, Katzenelson, and Weizmann. Katzenelson, there is a Katzenelson, there are two Katzenelsons in the Jewish leadership of the issue. The political leadership of the time, Bucky echoed the awareness of the need to comply with this ideological imperative, with the ideological imperative of bringing more kids, of increasing fertility among the population, but also challenge it by suggesting the necessity for coexistence between the Zionist ideology and the demographic observation. I'm sorry, I was wrong. It was as a result of cutting paragraphs. Okay, so Bucky said, I'm aware that I'm aware of the need or the ideology of viewing the Jewish population in the issue as one piece, as one homogenic entity. Okay, but so he understands the needs, the ideological need to do that, but still he said that in spite of this ideological imperative, he challenged it by suggesting the necessity for coexistence between this Zionist ideology and demographic observation. He said we have to create demographic, we have to do some demographic observation and to create knowledge about the population. And he was speaking mainly about ethnic origins, or about a country of origin. Never mind. Ethnic origin. I mean, where do these people come from? Okay, so categorizing ethnicity was not a simple task of looking for regularities among coherent social groups, which seemed to be a law of nature. There was no stable, clear demographic object. I mean, Mizrahim was a popular and religion a category, but it wasn't a demographic or scientific category. So there weren't clear demographic objects to observe and measure. Bucky had dealt with a phenomenon whose definition and coherency were yet to be constructed, as he reported in hindsight. I quote, the regularity and changing structure of the population, the heterogeneity of the social structure of the Jewish population, which renders of little value the use of general average for the entire Yishuv. The lack of any complete consensus of population after 1931, complete census of population after 1931, and the consequent necessity of using estimates of population, which became more and more unreliable with the lapse of time, all make the scientific and systematic research of the Jewish population inevitable. The tension between Zionist ideology and the diversity of the emerging new society is resolved in a particular objective category of ethnicity limited by time, place of birth. This is a temporal category, since place of birth applies only to the first generation of Israeli Jews, and the father's place of birth applies only for the second generation. By the third generation, which is around 95, this is what happened in 1995, by the third generation, this category was supposed to disappear. Place of birth reconciled the discrepancies between official Zionist ideology, which moved toward rejecting classifications of ethnicity, and the requirement to study the differences between the Jewish groups. Moreover, place of birth does not only solve the contradiction between Zionism and constructing ethnicity, it is also a category that replaces race for Mizrahim, who are visible minorities. Bucky's first demographic research in Palestine was on the birth rates of women from Haifa and Jerusalem, based on 40,000 cases of infant mortality and live births collected in the 1938 British census, as he wrote as he published in 1941. In his analysis, he found that the ratio between the two cities was almost double, 1 to 1.77, which he understood as caused by the fact that most women in Haifa were born in Europe, while Jerusalem was populated by the old Sephardic Jewish Yishuv. A few years later, Bucky divided this data set into three independent variables of mother's place, father's occupation, and residence. With these variables, Bucky was able to show that the number of births is correlated with the country of origin, divided into two major groups of Asia, Africa, and Europe, America, place of residence and occupational status. This early work demonstrates Bucky's innovative conceptualization of geostatistics, as well as his sociological view about the correlation between occupational status and country of origin. In a lecture he delivered to gynecologists in 1944, he explained the logic behind the ethnic classification and argued that when making comparisons to the average family, the population of Hebrew women in Eretz Israel is divided into three major types: the Asian, the European, and the local Israeli women. This is due to the exceptional variability among Jewish women in mandatory Palestine whose birth rates cannot be measured and studied as a coherent group. Ashkenazim and Mizrahim or Sephardim, well, yes, okay. No, I can't tell. Ashkenazim and Mizrahim or Sephardim were partially based on traditional divisions common at the time and which had been institutionalized from the beginning of the 20th century and even earlier. But while these divisions related mostly to religious customs, Bucky gave these categories a wider meaning that referred to social, cultural, and economic aspects of people's lives. The indicators that Bucky used to determine the cultural distinctiveness of different groups were language, religious, cultural traditions, religious and cultural traditions, biological traits, geographical location, education, and hygiene. Striving to describe a coherent statistical object, revealing the natural number of births would enable the statistician to describe the biological distinctiveness of Mizrahim. The natural number of birth rates would be displayed if we were to control social and cultural interventions that transform these rates into a lower number. In other words, if fertility among Jews with European descent was natural, said Bucky, it was possible that a woman could deliver as many as 5 or 6 children, but statistics show that reality was very far from this prediction, and the average fertility of European women was 1.7. Okay. One of the themes that, I'm coming to the, one moment. Bucky's argument about the need to trace demographic trends was related to the actual existence of the Jewish nation in its own homeland. It is our desire, and I quote, and in our capability to create a social structure that will contain the capacity for self-preservation. The presence of Jewish groups and their reproductive rates, he maintained, create the capacity to build a state. His early demographic studies conducted at the Hadassah Central Medical Bureau of Statistics laid out the conceptual infrastructure for objectifying the Mizrahi category. These studies were based on dichotomies that mostly place East and West in opposition. opposition society was presented as a problem due to its problematic groups. The solution to this is to make all aspects of society legible through statistics by offering a technology for making these groups noble. And one might say that his analysis of extreme groups, such as Yemenite and Austrian mothers, represents an evident eugenic attitude or eugenicist attitude, which was common in those days and went along with the Zionist ideology of other leaders and social scientists such as Arthur Rupin. Reading in the last 2 weeks on Rupin writings, Eitan's writing on Eitan's book on Rupin, I can say with confidence that Bucky's worldview was far from being eugenicist. His scientific numerical predictions, which had never before seen so systematically presented in Palestine by any other professional, including Arthur Rupin, were an instrumental framework to understand the complexity of the demographic problem between the two nations, intersected with a threat on the homogeneity and quality of the Jewish society. Okay. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. And we'll move immediately to our last speaker, Derek Penslar. Please.
Can you hear me all right? Hello? Can people hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to take part. I'm sorry I'm not there in person.
But at least now you're on the screen.
Right, is it all right for me to start or should I wait? Or?
Yeah, you can start.
All right, great. So, well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to take part in this. I wish I were there in person. And it's nice to revisit something that I haven't really thought about for quite a long time, because it's been about 30 years since I published Zionism and Technocracy, and the field of Zionist historiography has changed so enormously over that time, as we've heard from the papers this morning. I mean, not only has it excavated the history of the Zionist movement and the Yishuv in the early state of Israel to a far greater extent than was the case a generation ago, it's brought theoretical sophistication and a global and comparative outlook to the study of, after all, what is a minor nationalist movement and a minuscule state. Zionism has come under scrutiny as a multidimensional project combining social, cultural, and geopolitical aspirations. Teleological views of Zionism as a drive towards state creation have been replaced by more capacious and open-ended ones. Comparisons between Jewish immigrants to pre-1948 Palestine and other parts of the globe have demonstrated the limited reach of Zionist ideology and the dominance of practical grounds for immigration. The sensibilities and aspirations of the Yishuv's Middle Eastern Jewish communities and areas of mutual contact and mutual influence between Palestine's Arab majority and Jewish minority have become common topics of inquiry. The older focus on labor Zionism as the Yishuv's leading sector, which we just heard about, has given way to narratives highlighting the significance of bourgeois and religious Zionisms. Approaches from cultural and gender studies have retrieved lost voices and found new meanings in familiar ones. Now, the most commonly employed conceptual construct in recent Zionist historiography has been that of colonialism, and in particular, settlement colonialism. The colonial approach explores Teda Herzl's search for great power protection over Palestine, as Tal mentioned, the interwar Jewish national home's dependence upon the British mandatory government, and Zionist views of Palestinian Arabs through an Orientalist European lens. Zionist settlement is embedded into a colonial framework through direct examination of the expropriation and removal of Arabs from their long-held and long-worked lands, as well as comparisons between Zionist practice and that of settler colonial regimes in North America, Australasia, apartheid-era South Africa, and pre-1962 French Algeria. So today what I want to talk about is where the concepts of technical expertise and technocracy, where these two concepts fit in within these broader historiographic transformations. The alleged connection between technical expertise and Zionist coloniality lies in the movement's origins. A long line of works by Palestinian scholars, from Edward Said's seminal essay on Zionism from the standpoint of its victims in 1979, to Rashid Khalidi's book, The 100 Years War on Palestine, A Century of Settlement Colonialism, published just last year, attribute great importance to Theodor Herzl's 1895 diary entry in which he wrote that the, quote, poor native population would be removed prior to the founding of a future Jewish state. In 2000, the philosopher Muhammad Ali Khalidi wrote that the planned expulsion of the Palestinians may be proven by the fact that there's only one Arab character in Herzl's novel, Alt-Neuland. For both Khalidis, the act of expropriation and the Jewish polity's high levels of technical achievement are connected. Similarly entangled in pro-Palestinian historiography are Herzl's description of the new Jewish polity in his pamphlet, The Jewish State, as a, quote, rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. The pamphlet's lengthy passages on the technological sophistication with which Jews will be transferred to their new homes is also cited in such literature. Now, a more direct framing of technical expertise and colonialism in terms of colonial practices on the ground has been made by a number of scholars, including Gershon Shafir, Gabi Peterberg, and Noor Masalha, regarding Arthur Rupin, the political economist and statistician who founded the ZO, Zionist Organization's Palestine Land Development Company in 1908. Rupin compared the PLDC with the Prussian Colonization Commission, which purchased tracts of land in Prussian Poland in order to reduce the Poles' hold on the land and enable mass settlement by ethnic Germans. Now, in fact, Rupin did not make this comparison frequently, nor is it clear that he likened Palestinian Arabs to Poles as rivals, if not enemies, of the Jewish and German populations, respectively. But the alleged connection, I remember seeing it in a couple of documents, has become common in literature on early Zionism as fundamentally a settler colonial enterprise. I think a more nuanced assessment of the relationship between expertise and colonialism in pre-1948 Palestine came from Jacob Norris. In 2013, he published a book that depicted British developmental efforts in Palestine as central to a colonial policy of rational self-interest. Norris observes, however, that the cult of development in the pre-1948 Middle East was hardly unique to Britain's and France's mandates in the former Ottoman Empire. After all, the affirmation of technology lay at the heart of the Nakhda, the Arabic literary renaissance of the fin de siècle, of Ottoman economic policies in Palestine, and of middle-class Palestinians' own ventures in manufacture and trade during the late Ottoman and mandatory periods. Zionists were able to convince British authorities, nonetheless, of their technical and managerial superiority, leading to their receiving government contracts that caused Palestinian resentment while augmenting the economic clout of key individuals within the Yishuv. Frederick Mayton's imaginative 2019 book on the electrification of Palestine made a similar argument, embodied in the charismatic revolutionary turned entrepreneur Pinchas Rutenberg, whose electrical grid helped define the contours of the future Jewish state. Intriguingly, though, there's been very little conversation between the scholarship on Zionism, expertise, and colonialism, to which I've just been referring, and an entire different body of scholarship about the young state of Israel's developmental assistance programs in Africa, basically from 1958 to 1973. During this period, Israel presented itself, and more important, was perceived in Africa as anything but an agent of colonialism. As recent articles by Anat Morville and Dan Heller have observed, African leaders welcomed the assistance and did not classify it as condescending, paternalistic, or a form of cloaked imperialism. Indeed, they claimed Israel was a model of post-colonial state building, devoted to agricultural and industrial development, and an example of successful anti-colonial rebellion, in that the Zionists had driven the British out of Palestine. At the turn of the 1950s, leaders in the Tunisian and Algerian national liberation movements had kind words for Israel as a counter to the geopolitical strivings of Gamal Abdel Nasser. Ahmed Ben Bella of the FLM, first president of the independent state of Algeria, lived for a time in the Alexandria home of the parents of the Jewish writer Jacqueline Kahanoff. They didn't know who he was under a pseudonym, but he said nice things about Israel. Of course, the developmental assistance program was an exercise of soft power. It had propagandistic as well as humanitarian aims, but its popularity and endurance, even after the 1967 Middle East War, demand attention. In comparison with the literature on Zionism within the framework of colonial expertise, work on Zionism's debt to hierarchical and exploitative forms of power within Europe, that is not colonial power abroad, but power employed against the citizens of one's own state within Europe, is much more scarce. There is a long tradition of work associating Zionism with social reform, and we just heard this in Tal's paper. And Theodor Herzl's fascination with the cooperative settlement scheme of Franz Oppenheimer stemmed from his own personal desire to alleviate poverty and forestall social revolution. But as we learned from Eitan Blum's book about Rupin, there is a fine line between liberal and conservative approaches to mitigating the social problem. Both stemmed from feelings of trepidation of the laboring masses and aspired to leave capitalism in place. According to recent Israeli scholarship, Herzl's Altneuland was an anti-democratic society where laborers lack autonomy and decision-making is concentrated in the hands of experts like Joe Levy, important figure in Altneuland who we never meet, but we simply listen to him in a long phonographic recording at a Passover Seder. Now, what of Rupin here? Well, Rupin both maintained and departed from Herzl's legacy. Whereas Herzl envisioned a cosmopolitan Jewish polity, Rupin, as pointed out in Blum's book, fantasized about Jewish purity, embodied in what he claimed to be untainted Ashkenazic Jews, as opposed to dysgenic Sephardi and Middle Eastern ones. Racialism helps account for Rupin's Zionist passion, motivated more by fear than love for the people or the land of Israel. But for Rupin, racialism was inseparable from the imperative to ground Palestine's new Jewish community in a stable and equitable economic system. Rupin's complex and tutelary schemes for the selection of Jewish immigrants and the structure of Zionist settlements faded out, given their paltry budgets and the actual trajectory of the first collective farms. In other words, Rupin's worldview may have driven him to Zionism, but his flexibility and pragmatism are what allowed him a modest level of success. As a result, the Sturm system, to which Blum refers in his book, did not strike roots in Palestine, and during the interwar period, labor management corporatism did not strike roots in the Yishuv, despite Jabotinsky's endorsement of it. So I've talked so far about technical expertise, and now as I move to the end, I want to talk about technocracy. What's the difference? The former is a type of competence. The latter is a form of governance. Some reviewers of my book from 30 years ago claimed I was presenting technocrats as apolitical and thus removed from the political consequences of their actions. I actually went back to the book, which I had not looked at in decades. And I saw that in the introduction, I clearly stated that technocrats are no less likely to be ideological or politically minded or to serve political ends than any other person who exercises or seeks authority. Nor is it the case that the technocrat deals with the matter and the politician with people. The technocrat might very well be a social scientist or administrative expert who treats people like matter, as we just heard in the last paper about statistics. The technocrat, however, may serve in political leadership without being visibly or explicitly tied to a political machine, party, or ideology. This is a definition of technocracy. More important still is the basis for the claim to authority. The technocrat claims expert knowledge, usually required via formal training and credentials. It is these credentials that create the possibility of allegedly, although not in real life, but allegedly transcending the political machine. The technocrat both benefits from the trust garnered by Unparteilichkeit, by this kind of neutrality, and the distrust generated by anti-elitism, or the fine line separating many people's perceptions of complex and esoteric knowledge, the latter giving rise to, for example, in our own day, the widespread hatred of Anthony Fauci in the contemporary United States. In other words, the technocrat can be a figure of trust because of his or her claim to neutrality, but the technocrat can also be an object of great fear, precisely because they don't fit into a political machine. Now, I did make an important mistake in my book from decades ago, which is I underestimated the power of the technocrat to not only serve political interests, but to craft those interests. And at this point, Mayton's book on Rutenberg makes a very important corrective. That said, when one goes beyond the pre-state period, the period of the Yishuv, to the period of statehood, technocracy on such a magisterial level, well, it disappeared. As Aryeh Kramp has shown, throughout the history of the state, economic policy has been made in the prime minister's office or the cabinet out of raison d'etat. And the crafters of that policy have been elected politicians, although economic advisors embedded in the finance ministry have certainly played important roles. Expertise has never been a criterion for the making of economic policy in Israel. There's a long tradition in the Zionist project, we've heard this earlier in Tal's paper, of calling upon distinguished economic advisors from abroad in times of crisis, only to reject their recommendations as ignorant of particular features of Israeli society and culture that only Achad Me'itanu, one of us, could possibly comprehend. And this practice goes back to the Commission of Experts, the Sachverständige Commission, which advised dismantling the collective agricultural settlements, and it goes all the way up to Milton Friedman's prescriptions for privatization in 1977. They were ignored at the time, because what does Milton Friedman know? Such was the attitude. When Israel did adopt such policies, beginning in the mid-1980s, it was agreed upon by top political authorities in Israel and accepted in response to heavy American pressure. So summing up, in 20th century global history, technical expertise was ubiquitous. Technocracy was rare. The mutual dependence of expertise and state power characterized modern European states' domestic affairs and their overseas expansion, and was a pillar of post-colonial state development. In other words, it's ubiquitous. Ayn Rand's hero architect Howard Rourke, from her novel The Fountainhead, who has convinced a generation of socially awkward adolescents of their unappreciated genius, testifies to the aura of the far-sighted expert in context far removed from colonialism. Moreover, there is nothing inherently sinister about technical expertise. Pache, James Ferguson, James Scott, Tim Mitchell, and other anti-futurists, technological development does not always lead to environmental and societal catastrophes. Besides, nuclear weaponry, global climate change, and the despoiling of our ecosphere through plastics and other pollutants have resulted from not only techno-managerial hubris or blinkered vision, but also deliberate government decisions and a lack of political will. This is true across the board. It is true for Zionism as it is true for everything else in the modern world. Yes, the Zionist project made unwise developmental decisions, such as afforesting Palestine with European pines that do not thrive in hot and arid climates, or draining environmentally sensitive wetlands in the hula swamps. True. But technical expertise also provided millions of inhabitants of the state of Israel with clean water and protected them from deadly infectious diseases. In the modern world, be it that of nation states, empire, or post-coloniality, technical expertise is as benevolent or baleful as the vision of those who transform it into reality. And ultimately, those people are, I believe, in the political sphere. Such people may claim technical authority, thus constituting technocrats in the proper sense of the word. In the contemporary world, however, individuals with technical credentials, such as physicians, who enter politics must leave aside the methods by which their knowledge was acquired and tested. Think of all the physicians in the United States Congress or the last Secretary of Housing under the Trump administration, physicians who simply leave behind the entire scientific method when they become politicians. Politics is a realm replete with unfalsifiable statements, unrepeatable events. It is a fundamentally anti-scientific enterprise. It is rarely free from fictionalization and polarization. Technocracy is an ideal rarely realized within Israel, Palestine, or anywhere else in the world. Thanks very much.
Very much, Penslar. And now we can open the floor for people, questions, remarks. Shbal.
Thank you everyone for a very interesting session. I wanted to ask Anat, I'm not sure I got everything you wanted to say, and you obviously speak some of what you wanted to say. If I understood you correctly, you asked the question whether Becky's actions were racist or required, something like that. I understand. And it's actually an ethical question, I think, right? And if I understood you correctly, your answer relied on the fact that you did a rigorous work in order to answer that he wasn't racist. So I feel like I missed something in the middle.
No, this is not the answer that I gave to my own question. I know that at the beginning of publishing articles on I dare to relate eugenicist elements to some of the quotations that I brought in the paper, where in one of the papers where he compares between birth rates of Yemenite women.
סליחה שאני מתפרצת, אבל אנחנו לא שומעים בזום. אנחנו לא שומעים טוב.
כן, גם את השאלה לא שמענו טוב. אם אפשר לחזור על השאלה, לסכם אותה, כן, תודה.
Tal, do you hear now? Tal? Okay. So try to listen to the question. Okay. So the question was about some kind of a gap between the talk, whether the fact that Becky made a scientific, well-established scientific research is a kind of evidence against his being a pro-eugenic and racist. That was the question.
Yes, yes, it is correct. Well, I don't know how to answer to that question, but I know that as I said in the first part of my answer, that I identified eugenicist elements in some of his writings, where he was concerned about the fate of the society if we let Yemenite women to deliver babies according to what they are delivering now, according to probabilistic calculations that he made, compared to Austrian women. So it was clear that he didn't want a new society in the new state to be changed, that the balance would be changed into more Yemenite and other components of the population versus those who are Ashkenazi, such as Austrian women, and not only Austrian women. So he was concerned, and he expressed his concern. But what I was trying to say in between the cut off paragraphs is that his view was very similar to many prophets of modernity that were that acted at the same period in France and earlier in Canada and in other places. I mean, questions about the balance, the ethnic balance of society was something that was dealt with during that period, but was it an evidence to his view or to his encouragement of, let's say, stealing or Yemenite babies? No, it wasn't. It wasn't. I mean, what he expressed in his writing was something that was part of the way Jewish leaders in Israel, in Palestine, were thinking about the diverse ethnicity in Israel, and not only in Israel. I mean, so Bucky wasn't part of. I'm sure it had nothing to do with all these practices that are crimes, right? He had nothing to do with it. Okay, so he does not. We cannot put him under, the title of someone who acted in the dark ages of Israel. No, he was a very highly educated, an amazing scholar with huge knowledge. He had prestige all over the world for his methods and his writings and his probability calculations were part of what people did in periods of state building or nation building processes.
But okay. It just mean that he was as racist as the other people in his generation.
So you see, it's like what in fact, I think I wrote to Amos about the question of racism, Mizrahim, anti-Semitism, Jews. It bothers me that whenever we speak, whenever we say something about whenever we put on the board or on the paper quotes that relate to Mizrahim, then this is racism and the discussion is closed. And I am concerned about it because there is some historical anachronism in this way. Okay? Yes, I will finish. But this is my point of view, and I am very. I wrote paper on. I'm with you, totally with you. But I think when we study cases in the 50s, 40s, 20s of the 20th century, we need to adopt a different point of view when we analyze these texts.
Other questions? I have one. The camera will catch me, but usually it doesn't. Okay, so I have a question to Derek. You mentioned the fact that technocracy was never in the 20th century the real controlling power. But could we still have some differences between different places? So in some places it has more power than in the others, and I quite come to the little I know about the Zionism or Israel is that at least in the early years of Israel, technocracy was very weak here than in other places. But can we say something that it was stronger before or other, or how you can compare that to its position in other places?
I agree that, yeah, of course, you'd have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. The problem is that in the, before World War I mean, the Yishuv is just it's embryonic. There's so little to it that, of course, politics within the Yishuv is not terribly determinative of anything that's going on. It's political decisions that are being made in Europe and that are being executed at a time where, for someone like Rupin, I mean, this is the Wild West, and he has a lot of leeway and a lot of freedom that he regrets this later on in the 1920s. I mean, he writes in his memoirs how he kind of misses the before World War I, when it was just him and Jakob Thon, and and then things became much more bureaucratic afterwards. But when you look into the 1920s, 30s, my understanding is the settlement department of the ZO, becomes a huge bureaucracy, but ultimately it's subordinate to political interests. So again, I'm all in favor of talking about technical expertise. The concept of technocracy that suggests that that the technical expertise actually becomes the source of political legitimization. I mean, ultimately, who's running the Yishuv in the 1920s, 30s, 40s? It's not economic advisors and it's not scientists. It's political apparatchiks.
Thank you. Victor, please.
Yes, my question is to Anat. I was wondering, how did Bucky treat women? How did he categorize women of the old Yishuv, the old Sfaradim that were here?
The old Yishuv?
Yeah, the women of the old Yishuv. I mean, the old Sfaradim that were here throughout the generation. Okay, so he was contemplating between Asia, Africa, one group is Asia, Africa, and other group is Europe and America. And then a third group would be Sephardim, like Samechtet, that's pure Sephardim, and Bulgarians and Italians. He thought he belongs to the third group. But then after, so he, in his writings, you can see different, ways of categorizing ethnicity. But then in 1953, I think they, in the Lamas, the CBS, they decided to do it a dichotomy between Ashkenazim and Mizrahi. But I want to ask Derek, why? I mean, Bucky is not a technocrat for you. He's not a political figure. Roberto Bucky is like a Hamilton Code.
Yeah, I'm not disputing it. I mean, I'm just saying that in general, I guess what I've been reacting to is news, for example, with the chronic crises, let's say in the Italian government, and they say that they're bringing in a government of technocrats. So what there really is they're bringing in people who don't have specific political party connections, which in Italy, I guess, is very important. And so, and you get people who are primarily financiers, bankers, or whatever. But they are all actually in real life embedded into a political system, and they're chosen by political interests. And this is not conspiracy theory. I'm just saying that it's generally often the case. Of course, there's going to be exceptions, and Bucky was very influential. But my paper was quite broad about sort of deconstructing concepts of technocracy in the modern world. It was an idea that was very popular after World War II, where there was that whole literature on technocracy in the 50s and 60s. But I think it's fallen out of fashion among historians of science and technology because we've really passed that kind of moment of that love affair with technology. But of course, there are individuals with technical knowledge who can have a great deal of influence here and there.
Any further questions? So we are just on the time for finishing our session. So yeah.
So can I say a few sentences before we close this?
Yeah, please.
I'll try to be as short as possible. So I want to say something about the nature. Technocracy is not just the people and their relation within the governance. It's true, it's a package. It's also, you know, the cultural images and the kind of narrative that is projected. I want to say there was a moment in European history, colonial history, that technocracy, as my other colleague says, ruled, and that was in the early 20th century, and Zionism borrowed from it. You know, I'll just say this. I just want to point out that if you try to write a history of Zionism from a technocratic point of view, then you have a whole different story that I would like you just to think. You can think about the Chalutzim as a technological solution to a colonization program, to an organization that doesn't have money, to people that don't have experience and skills, okay? And they are pressed to politically to move forward and do something, and this is the only thing that is possible. And of course, then you have the generation of the narratives, as the Chalutzim, as the new heroes, that they are replacing Herzl engineers. And I'm repeating myself. I just wanted to close this circle before we finish here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for attending this session and for making it. And everyone here is invited to join us to the Chug HaTzfoni, and you can have your drink at home, whoever is.